Okay, world history. This is your second video for semester 3, week 3. And if you watch the first video, we left off where 1989 is a pendulum year. You start to see communist countries in Eastern Europe no longer get supported by the Soviet Union. And therefore, people started to protest, and those communist countries became more towards democracy. We also saw that the Soviet Union will cease to exist a couple of years later. It's like 1991, I think it is, when the Soviet Union will actually break into those 15 separate nations. Um, the other one that we're talking about today is what goes on in China, communist China. So if you remember on our notes that we did on our first video, I had you kind of write down the current communist countries. And of course, I started off with China. So as the communist countries are failing, China is also a communist country, and it's kind of like dominoes, where when one country, kind of has an uprising and overtopples the communist government, then the next country, then the next country, and so eventually, this will kind of hit, communist China. Now, the one thing, and I hope you understand, this is probably one of many important things I hope you can remember from this unit on Tiananmen Square, because to me, this is something. Of all the things in world history, I think this is probably one of the bigger ones that needs to be taught. But and this is going to be hard for you guys to understand, is that when the Tiananmen Square protest took place, there was no such thing as social media. That's right. There was a point in time when social media did not exist. There was no Facebook, no Instagram, no Twitter. There was no YouTube, and so to me, what to me the connection is how the news spread of this protest in Tiananmen Square without the use of social media. Of course, today we know the power of social media. When you hit that SEND button and you send something to one of your friends and they forward on to the next friend, and etc., news travels pretty quick. And so as we get into the protest here, I'll probably re-emphasize a few times that this protest will continue to grow and get bigger without the use of social media. Okay, so this is the failed Asian Spring, Tiananmen Square, and I just call it, plain and simple, Red China. Okay, so again, this is the part where you're going to be doing your note taking here, pen in hand, and then obviously converting it into creating your living document. Okay, probably one of the most iconic images of the Tiananmen Square protest / massacre is this picture here of a guy standing in front of the tanks. This is after the protest was kind of like broken up, and as the tanks are rolling in the Tiananmen Square to kind of like surround it so the protesters don't return, this guy basically plays like a game of chicken with his first tank, where he just when the tank moves left, he moves left, and probably one of the most iconic images. In other words, he was ready to have a tank run him over if he needed to. Okay. So here we go. Tiananmen Square. Well, first of all, Tiananmen Square is just this really large, huge plaza in Beijing. Okay, it's one of those things in Beijing. If you went to it, this would probably be on your tour guide. This would be something that you'd be told, hey, you need to go check out Tiananmen Square. It's this big, huge plaza in Beijing. It's got a lot of obviously Chinese historical significance to it. Tiananmen Square is also where Chairman Mao he'll come into, even though he's dead, he'll come into play here in this 1989 protest in China. But Chairman Mao gave his first speech as the leader of China. So again, it has a lot of significance. So again, if you're living in Beijing, this is one of the areas, Tiananmen Square, that you definitely know about. Tiananmen Square also kind of hosts like some of the major military displays, military parades. So we see that even here in the United States every once in a while. We'll have like a little convoy and have like a military parade of our tanks and maybe our latest, greatest weapons and stuff. And so Tiananmen Square was also known to have military displays. So that tells you a little bit about the size of this plaza in Beijing. And there it is. As you can see, smack dab right in the middle, you can't miss it, is that huge portrait of Chairman Mao. And so even though he has been dead since like 1976, images and probably stories and his history lives on in China. So in Tiananmen Square, you'd be greeted by the mugshot. Maybe I shouldn't say mugshot, but yeah, you'd be greeted by the mugshot of Chairman Mao. As we mentioned earlier, 1989, and again, I'm not a date guy, but again, if I had to be a date guy, and I would say, hey, there are like 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 dates that you might need to know. The events of 1989 would probably make my top 10 list. So again, we know from our previous big idea on the end of the Cold War that many communist nations were collapsing. And so when the Soviet Union was kind of going bankrupt and they stopped funding other communist countries, they were collapsing and they were then falling into democracy. Now, what's interesting, there was this old timer by the name of Hu Yaobang. Yeah, Hu Yaobang. And he was like a Chinese official who was actually very pro democracy. He was actually very pro change. And even though he was an old timer, kind of like Mr. Flynn, he had the ability to kind of connect to the youth. And so the youth kind of like this guy. They liked what he had to say. He'd be one of those guys that, when he would stop and he would talk, people would stop and they would listen. And so he was very influential to many of the youth of China, a very pro-democracy individual. And he passes away again, April 14th, 1989. Now, what happens is, and again, he's just a pro-democracy official. So again, that just basically means he's kind of in the government. I think he also did some teaching at some of the universities in Beijing. So again, he was like a well-known person, but he was just a pro-democracy official. Now, what's interesting is that when he passes away, this is not a surprise because he was so popular with the youth. Students started to gather at Tiananmen Square, kind of like a memorial, to this guy who they had a connection with. Just a time to kind of come together and kind of like pay their respects. Now, what's interesting is that in most of these gatherings that we see today, people come, people gather, then at some point people leave. I don't know if this is a good example, but we've all probably have been to maybe a funeral, or maybe you went to like a visitation at a funeral, where you kind of gather together, to kind of pay your respects to someone. And what happens is at those funerals is, people will gather, people will talk, people will like share stories and whatnot. But at some point, people are going to leave. They just do, and life kind of goes on. But what's interesting here is that as the students started to gather at Tiananmen Square, students were like not leaving, and not only were they not leaving, the crowds were getting larger. Now, here's my connection again. My connection again, as the crowds were getting larger, this is being done without the use of social media. And again, today, we wouldn't be surprised, by crowds getting larger each day because of social media. But again, there was no social media in China during this time. And so without the news being spread by social media, that's to me an intriguing part of the stories, that crowds weren't leaving and they were getting bigger every day. Eventually, the protests kind of started to pick up what we'd say is like a political theme, something to talk about, something to kind of rally around. So they talked about the students, economic reform. They talked about the inflation, the high prices. They talked about the corruption in the government and just kind of how the government kind of ran things. But at the end of the day, if you're going to remember one thing, that the protest basically kind of came to be, it became a calling for democracy. It was the calling for the end of the one-party communist rule, a more open government, an opportunity for elections and for choice. And so if you remember one thing about the protest, I think it's the word democracy is what the students really started to gather. As you can see, the students here kind of gathering, they're marching. every year I kind of hope I get like a foreign exchange student from like China, who can like read me this sign that this young man is holding up, because I never know. I teach this unit every year, and I have no idea what that sign says. But yeah, one of these times, so hopefully maybe somebody can like translate it. In fact, if somebody could like maybe translate that sign, there's probably like a Google Translate or something out there that can probably do it. I hope it's appropriate. But if somebody wants to translate what this young man is holding up on his poster and let me know, that would be great. That would be awesome. That'd be like bonus learning that you can become like legendary down the road. But the one thing about the protest that jumps out at me, I don't see any weapons. I don't see any tear gas. I see jeans. I see people with watches, collar shirts tucked in. So I don't see like anything, like militia as in this one picture. And of course, there's many pictures, and so, but at least in this one picture, that's kind of what I noticed here. Okay, now here's the other big connection. The other big connection is at the time of the protest, when the protest just started to gather, the leader of the Soviet Union, and we know this guy because he's from the Cold War, Mikhail Gorbachev, had scheduled months in advance. I mean, this is like months in advance that Mikhail Gorbachev, the leader of the Soviet Union, was going to go to Beijing, China, and he was going to meet with Deng Xiaoping. And again, this is months, maybe even a year, because these things are usually planned out at least a year in advance, months and maybe a year in advance, that these two world leaders were going to have a summit. And so whenever you have like world leaders get together, for some reason they call it a summit. And so it just so happened to be that China wanted to use this opportunity to kind of show off, just kind of like, what, China's doing, the successes they had. So China here, in preparation of Mikhail Gorbachev coming to China, had allowed Western media, news agencies to come into China. Now, here's the important thing. These news agencies like CBS, NBC, and this is also like the infancy of cable TV. Yeah, cable TV was it's not like it is today. And really, when it came to cable news, there was really only one cable news network, and that was CNN. And so CNN was there in China, again, along with the BBC, which is from Great Britain. But these news agencies, now this is important to know, were in China, and their purpose was to cover the summit between Mikhail Gorbachev and Deng Xiaoping. So again, China here allows in Western media to cover this summit. And of course, we know that's Mikhail Gorbachev, former leader of the Soviet Union. Okay, so here you can see this picture. Now, I think this picture kind of sums it up pretty good. The summit is basically a couple old guys sitting around a round table, having a drink, and everybody else kind of stands around and watches. And you're probably thinking the same thing that I'm thinking, and that is, Mr. Flynn, that looks extremely boring. And I agree. I mean, if I was with the media and I'm sitting there with my camera and my microphone, I got my pen in hand, notepad, and I'm taking notes on this summit between Gorbachev and Deng Xiaoping, I'm like, it just looks boring. It doesn't look like it's going to be any fun. Everyone looks kind of like stoic, and so to me, this is iconic picture, because literally across the street, you were getting this. That's the protest, kind of at its peak in Tiananmen Square. Now, what you notice in the picture that I just spun in is, to me, what I'm going to call the turning point of the protest, because there's always a turning point. And what the students had made, I don't know where it was made, and this is obviously going to be a great on deck question this week, is they made this huge statue. And of course, I think as you look at the statue, you have a pretty good idea kind of what it resembles. And obviously, we're thinking the Statue of Liberty out there in Ellis Island. And what I think is interesting about the statue, the kind of like taken after the Statue of Liberty, is where the students put the statue. And of course, we all know that you guys as students, when you do things on purpose, okay? And so this Tiananmen Square Plaza is like, again, it's gigantic. It's huge. The students could have put this statue like anywhere. But if you notice the significance of where they put the statue, Obviously, they put that statue smack dab right in the middle, staring eyeball to eyeball with Chairman Mao. So obviously, the students had this planned out. This is well calculated. And the statue kind of became known as the goddess of democracy. And so the students make it, they kind of wheel it in, drive it in. I don't even know how they get it there, into Tiananmen Square. And again, it's a symbol of freedom. It's the symbol of the West. It's the symbol of the United States. It's the symbol of the Statue of Liberty. So this was kind of like a turning point where I think the Chinese officials knew that they are not going to be able to control this and again, it's continued to get bigger and bigger without the use of social media. And the protest was also kind of picking up steam in some other cities, but Beijing kind of became the rally point, for this protest. Okay. Eventually, the protest in Tiananmen Square will lead to strikes. It'll lead to boycotts. And again, these strikes, protests, and boycotts grew throughout China without the use of social media. Eventually, what's going to happen under the cover of darkness, because again, most of the time this stuff happens under the cover of darkness, it becomes known as martial law. This is kind of like when the government basically, sends in its military, and it's basically to disperse any uprising, any crowd. And under martial law, there's basically no rules. You're not shooting in many cases rubber bullets. I mean, you're shooting real bullets. You're arresting people. No one's getting their rights read to them. So eventually, under the cover of darkness, probably like at 2 o'clock in the morning or something like that, the Chinese government reels in. Yeah, there you go. 10:30 p.m. on June 3rd, under the cover of darkness, the assault, this martial law to break up this crowd in Tiananmen Square. Now, what you have to remember is that the Western media is there. Okay, CBS, NBC, ABC, CNN. I got all these news agencies, and again, they are there to cover the summit. So you can imagine saying, "Okay, I'm not going to sit around here and watch two old guys drink." And they started to obviously cover this assault that took place on June 3rd to break up the crowd at Tiananmen Square. Nobody really knows the true numbers, but the rough estimate is thousands of protesters were killed, beaten and arrested. And again, this would be probably more played out today if there was social media and if people had cell phones. So again, 1989, people didn't have cell phones. So today, when something happens and when something goes down, immediately, we take out our phone and we take a picture of it or we record something. We would have a lot more pictures and images and videos today if there was social media and if people had cell phones. But the Western media was there, and so there are some pictures I'll share out here. Of course, you're going to be adding your own to your living document. Okay, so that's kind of like the martial law, and as you can see, that the tanks are rolling in. You got things that are on fire. The crowd is being dispersed, and again, it's going to take a while here to kind of disperse the crowd. And the key thing is, again, you got to make sure that the crowd doesn't return. So the tanks, they're not, they're not going anywhere. Okay, so again, here's one of the pictures here. But again, there's a lot of other pictures and some videos, but we'll share those out here in a few minutes. Okay. All right. Hey, in your Google Classroom, with our topic here, I have this. I think it's like a 2-minute video of Tank Man, and this is an individual that nobody knew this guy's name. And what happens is, as more tanks are rolling into Tiananmen Square to kind of secure the area to make sure that the protest doesn't continue or like reassemble, as tanks are rolling in, this one guy basically kind of stands in front of these tanks and basically is saying, for you to get to Tiananmen Square, you have to run me over. I mean, he's willing to die, and that kind of tells you a little bit, tells you something about the calling. I mean, when you're willing to die for something, I mean that's pretty big, and that's pretty intense. And so you can watch the video of Tank Man, and eventually in the video you'll see near the end, he'll be dragged away, kind of pulled away by, we're going to say, probably the secret police. I don't know if it was the Red Guard or not, but probably at this point, the police and the military probably were undercover, wearing civilian clothes, trying to infiltrate. But he was later arrested or dragged away by the secret police. And it's an individual where nobody knows who this guy was, nobody knows his name, and he hasn't been seen since. So you can kind of probably figure what probably happened to him. But his bravery, his courage, really kind of stands out of this Tiananmen Square protest that he was willing to be run over by a tank. Yeah, willing to be run over by a tank to stop these tanks from going in. Again, an iconic picture. Now, when you watch the video, um, you'll be able to hear in the background rapid machine gun fire. Yeah, rapid machine gun fire. So there was fighting that took place in the streets. And you'll also watch in the video and you'll hear in the video. Again, this is being recorded by somebody from the West. And again, the West was there to cover the summit. You'll hear people like chant and cheer for him, and so it's only about 2 minutes long. So, should watch it, but it's one of the most iconic video clips of the Tiananmen Square protest. Okay. Now, what's interesting is in China today, this incident is not in the history books. This incident is not marked by any plaques or any statues. If you think about here in the United States, we're really good at kind of honoring heroic deeds, or we honor maybe like a crisis if it's like 9/11 and we have like the 9/11 museum and the murals. If it was like a really bad like tornado, the town or city might eventually put something up. But this is something that is not allowed to be talked about in China. This is something that's not allowed to be taught about in schools. And so what China is trying to do is just basically kind of take this part of their history, rip the pages out of the book, and don't talk about it. So Chinese news media, schools cannot report on the protest. Even Google has agreed to like censor mainland China. So that's interesting, mainland China. So if you're in China today, and you're trying to Google, the Tiananmen Square, protest slash massacre, nothing comes up. It's kind of like being in Schoolcraft High School when you guys are on your Chromebooks and you're looking up something you're not supposed to be looking up, and then all of a sudden you get zapped by Mr. Weiss, and then you can no longer be on your Chromebook because you were looking something up or playing some music that was maybe inappropriate. But anyway, he won't say anything. Okay. So Google has agreed to kind of like limit its search engine in China. And again, to me, one of the big key moments of this is no social media at that time that would have made this event even bigger, maybe even made it successful. I don't know. I mean, the Chinese was pretty determined to break up the massacre, the protest that turns into the massacre. Okay. Now, the other thing that I would encourage you to do, and there's no way I'll know if you ever do it, but Tiananmen Square 1989. Obviously, last year was 2019. So if you guys are really good at math, 30 years. So it's been 30 years. And again, a lot of these things get honored and stuff. And so this is on our Google site, which I know you guys always like to visit every once in a while because it's such cool stuff. There's this video right here. It kind of marks it. And it's about 15 minutes long. So, I know it's a little bit long, but if you got some downtime, it just kind of like does a better job than Mr. Flynn kind of rehashing some live video clips of this Tiananmen Square protest. And so on our class site, if you're interested, go watch this video. It's really good. Marks the 30-year anniversary of the Tiananmen Square protest. And so if this story kind of piques your interest, this might be something maybe worth the watch. Okay. So again, put this into your living document and submit some pictures and stuff like that. And again, there's that Tank Man video with your Google site. On your Google Classroom to watch that, and a couple questions right there. So that should bring it to an end. Had a tendency to ramble, but man, I really miss being the sage on the stage. I really miss being in my classroom teaching. So, I decided to go old school here with pen in hand notes and hear myself talk for a while. So anyway, that's the Tiananmen Square /massacre. Signing off in 3, 2,